A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
Hey, they've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
We want to welcome the Gab community and remind you that you can find this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast. We play on the weekends on the405media.com at 5 p.m. on both Saturday and Sunday. So this is the 100th anniversary. This week will mark the 100th anniversary of the Communist Revolution in Russia, and therefore the beginning of when communism actually attained some power in the world. It had been around since Marx wrote his book, but in 1917, October 25th to 26th of the old calendar, in the new calendar it would be November 7th and 8th, the Bolsheviks took over in Russia. And what followed over the course of the rest of the 21st century was death. Upwards of 100 million people losing their lives throughout the various communist regimes. Frankly, the communists make Hitler look like a piker, but that doesn't quite get the media and historical attention that it should. Many years ago, actually 10 years ago, I wrote an essay about communism that I'm going to share with you today, entitled Fight the Memory Hole, Never, Never, Never Forget. Those too young to remember Soviet communism don't understand that the May Day celebrations, which occur in May obviously, are a worldwide celebration for international communism and its stepbrother, international socialism. When the Soviet Union existed, May Day showcased extensive military processions in communist regimes around the world. It has only been 30 years since the Soviet Union disintegrated, and already the memory hole has begun to swallow up the 100-year history of the international socialist movement. There are many, many people who wish to forget. Many want to bury the history of their own role in the movement over the years. Others simply want to protect the movement from its long and ugly history of being on the side of evil decade after decade. Most of the liberal elite of the 20th century worked hard to downplay the evil of communism. Today, the average college professor or liberal writer will dismiss communist evil as a given, as if it had always been recognized and categorized as such. This is the memory hole, that the truth is far more sinister. On this 100th anniversary of communism, remember the 100 million men, women, and children who were murdered or starved to death by a worldwide movement that many well-known American citizens supported, encouraged, defended, and fought for. Never forget the screams of the vanished. They are the legacy of collectivism. Those screams are an indictment of the many people who would prefer to bury the past. There is no rug big enough to sweep the truth under. In 1997, a brave French publisher released a book called The Black Book of Communism. It was a 757-page history of the crimes, terror, and repression of this 20th century movement. In an article in the Weekly Standard, Gerard Alexander wrote, quote, "It's no coincidence that the Black Book has been received with what its editor describes as a chill by the French commentariat, and has been ignored by the reviewers in the leading French newspapers, Le Monde, Le Figaro, and Libération. This is the real virtue of the Black Book, and other volumes like it. They offer the details that most news media and college classes won't. The pattern is plain. Over and over again, perceived abuses by Western societies, colonialism, the Vietnam War, etc., are revisited in conversation and thought until they are part of our mental furniture. What happens to the crimes of others is very different. Some of them get sucked down the memory hole." End quote. In May 2006, John Miller of the National Review wrote that Bard College in New York has an endowed chair named after one of the most notorious traitors in American history. It's called The Visiting Alger Hiss Professor of History and Literature. Ironically, the man who currently holds the position is actually trying to expose the crimes of communism, but he's getting a lesson in the memory hole. Jonathan Brent calls himself a registered independent and says he never voted for a Republican presidential candidate. In 1984, after meeting writers from Eastern Europe, he started publishing their work in a quarterly journal called Formations. And this is a quote from Jonathan Brent. Formations didn't start out as anti-communist, but it became that way over time. A lot of our writers were critiquing communism. He began publishing material on dissidents. Before long, several bookstores refused to carry Formations. Quote, they just wouldn't stock it, says Brent. Quote, it taught me about a sickness and a certain kind of left-wing politics, the notion that someone would accuse me of retrograde views simply because I was trying to defend the civil liberties of artists who were being oppressed by the state, end quote. He may have made some enemies, but he also made friends on both sides of the Iron Curtain. That experience led Brent to begin publishing a series of books called The Annals of Communism, based on access others had gained to Soviet archives. Their first book, The Secret World of American Communism, came out in 1995, and it generated headlines around the world. The book's 92 documents contained smoking gun evidence that the Communist Party of the United States of America, the CPUSA, was deeply involved in espionage against the United States. Furthermore, it buttressed the controversial claim by Whittaker Chambers, the man who originally accused Alger Hiss of spying, that Washington, D.C. was home to an elaborate network of clandestine agents in the 1930s. Other revelations included proof that billionaire Armand Hammer laundered money for the Soviets, and that Edmund Stevens, a prominent Moscow-based reporter, was on the Soviet payroll. Vitally, The Secret World of American Communism reproduced documents rather than merely summarizing them, and that is the entire quote from Miller's piece in the National Review. The two items that most often end up in the memory hole are, one, the extent of communist depravity throughout the 20th century, and two, the details of how many famous Americans in Hollywood, the literary world, the media, and politics who were fellow travelers of the movement denied or downplayed the reality, made excuses, or actually worked to undermine American influence in the world. What is the memory hole? By that I mean these facts are seldom acknowledged publicly, certainly not dwelled on, and actively ignored by today's elites, often because they had friends or relatives who played a part in that history. How come you never hear much about the history of communism in China or the Soviet Union? Why aren't films made about that period? It's not an accident. How do we put a face on the estimated 40 to 60 million who died in Mao's China? Here's just one story. Frightful deeds were done against people called class enemies, including a girl and her grandmother buried alive. "Granny, I'm getting sand in my eyes," said the child. "Soon you won't feel it anymore," replied the old lady, as dirt rose to their necks. That's a quote from a book by Farquhar and Schonels. The recent German-made movie The Lives of Others is a rare example of a film that deals with life under communism. It is quietly considered one of the best films in years, but organizers of the Berlin Film Festival refused to accept it as an official entry in 2006, and the filmmaker struggled to raise the $2 million he needed to make it in the first place. Again from the National Review. You can count on two hands and a foot the number of major motion pictures made since the dissolution of the Soviet Union that have attempted any kind of reckoning of the human cost of communism in the 20th century. Among the cultural cognoscenti across the world, there seems to be a hunger to let this subject simply slide down the rabbit hole. I think there may be another reason for the reluctance of the makers of pop culture worldwide to reckon with communism, and that is shame. The ideological struggle against leftist totalitarianism was something that did not arouse the interest or enthusiasm of cultural elites in the West during the Cold War. Far from it. From the 1960s onward, the default position of the doyens of popular culture was a presumption in favor of the communist struggle, as personified by Mao, the Viet Cong, Castro, the Sandinistas, El Salvador's guerrillas, and the so-called African liberation movements. This was not a reasoned or thought-through view. It was little more than fashion, and rarely, if ever, has history rendered a more devastating verdict on the wrongness of fashionable Western groupthink than it did when the walls and statues came down and Lenin was removed from his unholy pedestal." End quote. Though they got it wrong, and though they may not know it, they are ashamed of it and do not wish to be reminded of it. The list of well-known Americans with blood on their hands is shockingly large. From the arts, playwright Lillian Hellman, director Leo Penn, who, yes, was Sean Penn's father, director Herbert Bieberman, and author Dashiell Hammett, to name just a few. FDR's administration had quite a few communist spies, including Alger Hiss, Vice President Henry Wallace, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Henry Dexter White, Ambassador to the USSR Joseph Davies, Frank Coe of the International Monetary Fund, who later fled to China and became a top advisor there, and many others. Famous reporters include Soviet agent and American columnist I.F. Stone, influential during the 1950s and 60s, and Time magazine Vietnam War correspondent Pham Xuan An, a North Vietnamese spy, as it turns out. Both men are still celebrated by the left, and these are just a tiny percentage of the fellow travelers and spies from the Cold War. Here is just one story of how fellow travelers aided evil, and it's about the actor Paul Robeson, who is probably most famous for playing Joe in the film Showboat in 1936. He sang Old Man River. He was also a dedicated communist. And this is from Mona Charen's book. And she tells the story. Quote, "In 1948, Robeson traveled to the USSR after having said publicly that if there ever was a war between the US and the Soviet Union, American Negroes would not fight for the United States. At the time of Robeson's journey, rumors had begun to circulate that Stalin was preparing a new pogrom against the Jews. Robeson announced publicly that while in Russia he would meet with Itzhak Pfeffer, a Jewish communist poet who had visited the United States during World War II as a member of Stalin's Jewish Joint Anti-Fascist Committee. Pfeffer and Robeson had become friends. At the start of Stalin's anti-Jewish campaign, Pfeffer had disappeared. When Robeson asked to see Pfeffer in Moscow, he was told he would have to wait, that Pfeffer was, quote, vacationing in the Crimea, end quote. In fact, Pfeffer had been in prison for 3 years and was so emaciated that he was near death. While Robeson waited, Pfeffer was released and given medical treatment. He was fattened up for several weeks and only then permitted to meet with Robeson. And here author David Horowitz picks up the rest of the story. Quote, "The two men met in a room that was under secret surveillance. Pfeffer knew he could not speak freely. When Robeson asked him how he was, he drew his finger nervously across his throat and motioned with his eyes and lips to his American comrade. 'They're going to kill us,' he said. 'When you return to America, you must speak out and save us.' After meeting with the poet, Robeson returned home. When he was asked about Pfeffer and the other Jews, he assured questioners that reports of their imprisonment were malicious slanders spread by individuals who only wanted to exacerbate Cold War tensions. Shortly afterwards, Pfeffer, along with so many others, vanished into Stalin's gulag. It was not that Robeson had not understood Pfeffer's message. He had understood it all too well, because it was Robeson, near the end of his own life and guilty with remorse, who told the story long after Pfeffer was dead." End quote. Stories of betrayal, treason, and duplicity by prominent Americans such as Robeson are legion, if you are only willing to do your homework. So as we move into these 100-year celebrations of the Communist Revolution, remember the true cost. So there are a lot of memorials and statues all over D.C. and frankly all over the world that commemorate a lot of things. The Vietnam War Memorial is a wall that commemorates the death of a little under 60,000 men and women who died in the Vietnam War, and all of their names are listed. Nothing in the history of the world ever killed as many people as communism. And the only significant memorial that I'm aware of in the United States is in D.C. It's a singular statue that you would miss if you weren't looking for it, at an intersection in D.C. dedicated to the victims of communism. And you will find, if you do search it out in D.C., when you locate it, that there is almost always a bouquet of flowers that have recently been left there, most probably by somebody whose family was a victim. If you're interested in more information on this subject and a lot of American duplicity and involvement in this movement, including by a lot of very prominent people, I recommend the following 3 books: Whittaker Chambers' Witness, Red Star Over Hollywood by Ronald Radash, and the book Treason by Ann Coulter. So, we've had some movement on the healthcare issue. The president has issued some executive orders, one that will allow people to form and join in group plans across state lines. If that actually takes off, it can have a pretty significant impact on healthcare costs. And then he also refused to continue the subsidies for the insurance companies, something that he's been doing, I think, on a month-by-month or quarter-by-quarter basis here since he became president. I suspect that since the failure of repeal and replace and other alternatives as well, he felt it was time to burn the ships, as Cortez did, and light a fire under Republicans in Congress. So there was about a 24, 48-hour movement to try to save those subsidies by Alexander out of Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, and Patty Murray out of Washington, who is one of the dumbest members of the Senate, by the way. And they announced that they had an agreement to continue the subsidies for the insurance companies, and then the Democrats were apparently compromising by allowing some health plans to be formed in the states that don't necessarily have all the mandates in them. Lamar was very proud of himself, but it was clear within about 48 hours that it did not have Republican support in Congress, and even the president tweeted that he wouldn't support it. So it was dead. It got a lot of fanfare. Boy, the press just went crazy for 24 hours about how this deal had been reached to save these subsidies for insurance companies, but it never really had the life that they thought it did. And so that will pass, and these insurance subsidies are going to be discontinued. So the president continues to make bold moves on this subject. He also moved to decertify the Iran deal. Now, let's be clear that he hasn't actually decertified it. He made kind of a blustery speech, but after you listen to Tillerson and Haley, it appears as if right now it is simply a pressure tactic on the Iranians. We'll know more, I think, over the course of the next couple of months over whether or not they're actually going. What he's refusing to do is to certify. The law requires him the president, to constantly certify that the Iranians are in compliance. And what he's doing is announcing that he's not going to issue any more certifications that they're in compliance. It doesn't exactly negate the deal. It's a little difficult to describe. Essentially, Iran can keep doing what they're doing, and the United States is going to keep doing what it's doing. He's just not going to certify that they're in compliance. That does open the door for the administration to take moves, and it looks like they're going to list the Republican Guard as a terrorist organization, which allows the Treasury to make some moves on them. But we haven't actually seen any significant moves yet against the Iranians that would hurt them in any way, that would signal that the deal is actually dead, because the Iranians are pretending as if the deal is still full faith and credit, and they're still moving forward. So I think it's a little bit difficult right at this moment to tell whether this is a negotiating tactic to get some kind of a concession, or whether the president intends really to fully reset this thing and throw out the deal.
Isn't it a little late to bother to throw out the deal when we already paid those billions of dollars? Or not we, but Obama.
Well, that part's already done, and it's well into the hands of terrorists by now, I'm sure. But there are a number of concessions in the deal to the Iranians and their civilian nuclear program, which no one actually believes exists. And so what the U.S. essentially, if you boil it down, what the U.S. is essentially doing in the Iranian deal is not using their vast power and influence over the banking world and over the business world to prevent business relationships with Iran or money from flowing. So by announcing that he's no longer going to certify them as in compliance, it opens the door for the president to unleash the full force of the United States to pressure international banks and to make sure that no multinational corporation can do any business with Iran. Now, they have to actually take those steps, and they haven't fully taken those steps. But by saying that he's not going to continue to certify the deal. He's essentially unchained the pit bulls, but he hasn't actually yelled sick 'em yet as far as all of the tools the United States has to begin to cut off the Iranians economically. And the Europeans have a lot more relationships with the Iranians, so this deal, which included them, is oftentimes about their ability to do business with Iran, not necessarily the United States, because when the United States issues certain proclamations that you can't do business with us if you do business with the Iranians, it's really the Europeans that are affected, because obviously their relationship with the United States is worth a lot more money than the one with Iran. So these kinds of edicts don't result necessarily in an end of business with American companies because they're really not doing any business with the Iranians, but it does force the Europeans to choose. And so they're the ones right now that are squawking. They're unhappy that the president has announced what he's announced, and they're trying to claim that he can't unilaterally withdraw from the deal. And the reason you get all of that kind of barking from them is because they have a lot more to lose from being barred from doing any economic business with the Iranians. I think that, again, we'll see. It appears as if it's a negotiating move to get some concessions. The Iranians seem to have signaled that they don't intend to change a thing. So what I suspect is going on here is the president hopes that the Europeans will put pressure on the Iranians to make some concessions in order to save those business relationships. I doubt that will happen, and I think ultimately the president will move forward with the sanctions that are allowed under law. I want to make the point, though, that by doing these kinds of things, cutting off the insurance companies and pulling out of the Paris Accord and now refusing to recertify the Iranian deal, Donald Trump is showing a tremendous amount of courage. This guy is standing almost alone against a sea of globalists and neocon traitors in Washington, D.C. Just this week, George Soros announced that he was moving most of his fortune, $18 billion, over to his Open Society Foundation, which is the group that does all of the left-wing work in the world and in the United States. This is a massive war chest for funding activists and marketing campaigns and all the rest. To give you some idea how massive that is, the Koch brothers don't spend more than a few $100 million on an annual basis. And George Soros has just given his foundation an $18 billion endowment. Think of how much money that's going to throw off on an ongoing basis to literally fund anarchist, globalist, communist, crony capitalist, sometimes known as fascism, movements and ideas. This is a lot of money. And it seeps down and ends up employing tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who work constantly to try to undermine the fabric of our society. I think it should not go unrecognized that George Soros wants his legacy to be an absolute open declaration of war on the American principles. The President of the United States needs our help, and he needs our strong support. This is a fight that's going to last a long time. They have a tremendous amount of money. We're fighting the world's global elites who have all the power and all the money, and they fire at us from the commanding heights. I want to talk a little bit about cloud cities and the Catalonia independence movement and bring two things that I've talked about in previous podcasts together. Part of what's able to drive and animate these independence movements is the change in technology and in economies around the world. So I had suggested that these kinds of independence movements may very well move to places like Italy, and there was an article in the last week mentioning just that this city of Milan and the region that contains and surrounds Venice are both having referendums, non-binding referendums on whether to declare independence from Italy, and those are moving forward. It's important to remember some historical facts. Italy was only formed into one country about 150 years ago. And those of you who know a little bit about your Renaissance history will remember that places like Venice were once city-states, autonomous, trading with the whole world, and very, very wealthy. These are still the wealthiest areas of Italy, and in a socialized world, in a world where they're highly taxed and that money is redistributed to other places in Italy, they can feel very resentful that they pay a lot of money that doesn't build bridges and hospitals and fund schools and things in their own area. Now, a lot of the nation states that formed over the last 250 years did so based on the Industrial Revolution model, the need for a lot of workers in factories, and for the economic protectionism that creating those kinds of boundaries could provide, as well as the ability to recruit and train peasants and regular folks into the military to provide a military buffer against attack from outside your own economic circle. Now that we live in a world that's changing dramatically, and technology is driving the formation of what I've described before as these cloud cities, where people in Los Angeles or New York or Venice can live very protected lives where they can have careers that involve essentially the internet and working at a desk, something many of them can do from home, and all of these goods and services can flow into the cloud cities. You can see why an extremely prosperous place like Venice would look at their tax burden and say, why am I paying for people down in Sicily and the boot of the peninsula when we can function entirely on our own? Now, whether or not it's entirely true or not, probably today the typical Venetian does not look around and worry about invasion, military invasion, the way they probably would have much more severely 100 or 150 years ago. So the idea of having all those peasants or poor people in the rest of Italy ready to be the armed soldiers to protect you seemed like a much more attractive and necessary trade-off 150 years ago than it does to a Venetian today. And the kind of economic protectionism that nation-states provided is almost the exact opposite of the modern globalist movement. And most people who live in the major cities of the world have jobs that are very dependent on international trade and globalism. So that's why they react very badly to the nationalism of Donald Trump or the nationalism that is expressed in some of these other movements throughout Europe. And they feel above it all, and they do nothing but cast aspersions and express disdain and all of that. But my point, the larger point I'm trying to make, is that the things that drove a city dweller in Venice to accept the trade-offs of national boundaries and being kind of lumped in with all of the rest of Italy, a lot of those just don't seem as necessary to a modern Venetian or a modern Parisian or the wealthier folks in Catalonia when they look at the rest of Spain. And that is, at its core, I believe, what's driving these independence movements, and why I think ultimately they probably are going to be successful. I would not be surprised to see over the next generation or two a number of city-states begin to be reformed. Places like Catalonia breaking apart from Spain and declaring themselves essentially a city-state, an area of Barcelona with some countryside that surrounds it, and a place like Milan or Venice declaring themselves a city-state again. Now, they're going to have to, in some of these cases, they're going to have to back that up with a military. So we'll see just how hard the rest of the countryside is going to press against them on this. But of course, the rest, if you think about this again in economic terms, if these wealthier areas of Italy, for instance, let's use them as an example, if they move forward with breaking apart and forming their own city-states, to the average Italian in the rest of the country, that means a lower standard of living and ultimately increased impoverishment, because in a socialized economy, they're depending on that wealth transfer that is going on in those places. So again, there are a lot of people in those areas that are going to be looking at that all and those movements, those independent movements, as a direct economic and perhaps physical threat to themselves. How much are they motivated then to pick up a gun and to hold those places hostage, essentially at the threat of violence? I think all of that's going to get tested as we go forward. But it is, without question, creating a lot of these modern technologies is creating and giving life to a lot of these independence movements by smaller places, cities, and the surrounding areas wanting to break off and form city-states. A lot of the things that drove that just aren't as concerning as they once were. They could reappear, but for now, the way technology is moving, it is entirely possible for a place like Venice to exist as an autonomous city-state again, as it once did some time ago. We'll see. We'll see. I noticed that the two of the leaders of the independence movement in Catalonia were charged with sedition and arrested. That produced a candlelight vigil of a few 100,000 Catalonians. I looked at that picture and I thought, yeah, that's not going to be enough. If you want independence, the pacifist approach is a good one, and I praised them for that early on, taking that kind of Gandhi-esque approach. But at some point, you're going to have to put yourself in harm's way. You're going to have to, Gandhi understood, if you understand what he did, it was not exactly a pacifist movement. What he was trying to do was to hold the high ground against his opponents, in this case, the British, by forcing them to commit violence that he and his people would not respond to. But, a lot of his people were killed in the course of that movement. So there was a tremendous amount of violence that took place. But by refusing to reciprocate, by refusing to devolve into, say, guerrilla warfare or what have you, Gandhi's approach was to shame the British and the British people by forcing them to commit atrocities and to commit violence. And he held the high ground because his side wasn't replying in kind. And ultimately, the British people decided to let them have their independence. Now, probably in an evolved society in, say, Spain or Italy, that same tactic can work, but a candlelight vigil is not going to get you there. You're going to have to continue to provoke the other side and test just how violent they're willing to be to prevent you from succeeding in your independence movement. And lives are going to be lost in that process. Another NFL update, I saw that CBS and Viacom stock is dropping because analysts expect their earnings to be down due to falling viewership for the games. So for those of you who are participating in the NFL boycott, it's working. I don't believe that we're anywhere near capitulation, though. I was just listening to somebody on Fox News the other day say exactly what I had said here on the podcast. She was talking about how we've seen these kinds of angry protests before, but people are not going to give up their NFL, and in about 8 weeks, most of these viewers will return because they love their NFL teams. And it was precisely what I talked about. She is fully, and by the way, she's not on our side. She was sneering as an elitist because she believes that the average American is so addicted to these kinds of bread and circus games that while they may participate in a protest for a couple of weeks, ultimately they can't live without things like the NFL and cheering for their team, and that they will slowly but certainly trickle back into the viewership of these games, and that everything will be fine, and that the players can continue to do these protests, and it's not going to matter. And I have to say, I don't know whether she's right. We're going to find out. If you're committed to this, you really do have to start making other plans for your Sundays, and you have to make a commitment that isn't just about not watching the NFL, but finding something else that you do so that you replace the NFL in your life with something else, closing that door forever. Because I guarantee you, the owners and the people involved in making the money with the NFL, CBS, all the rest, they really do believe this will be short-lived. And if it goes on for 8 or 10 weeks, then they will make they won't make concessions, but they'll make some sort of movements where they'll have something at the Super Bowl that'll be a big celebration of the military during halftime, and they'll sing a bunch of patriotic songs. They'll try to do these kind of gestures to show that they still love the country and all of that, but they're not going to stop the players from disrespecting the flag. And so they're going to do a lot to kind of try to distract and to hoax people and to convince them that, we're still the patriotic organization that you think we are. All in an effort to slowly but surely lull everyone back to sleep and get them back in the bleachers so the gladiatorial games can begin again.
Exactly. I mean, there was supposed to be this big meeting between the owners and the players to resolve this issue. Well, they had their meeting, and guess what? Nothing was resolved.
Yeah, Roger Goodell gave some long-winded press conference for 30 minutes in which he essentially said nothing. He tried to talk about how much that it's not a protest against the flag, even though Colin Kaepernick made it very clear that that's precisely what it was. And in the end, when pressed by reporters, he basically said, no change. We're not going to force the players to stand for the anthem. So it was a complete waste of time, and he didn't move the ball at all. And I really think that ultimately Goodell's going to be pinned as the villain in all this, because the owners have a commissioner for the express purpose of forcing someone else to wear the black hat. The purpose of the commissioner is to be the bad guy and to enforce the rules so that the owners don't have to. And I think at its core, what was going on here when the whole controversy started was, I think the owners wanted to be able to stand in solidarity with their players, but they expected the commissioner to come up with a rule and demand under the threat of fine that everybody stand for the anthem, which gave them the best of both worlds. The owners wanted to be able to say, well, gosh, the commissioner has made it a rule now, so we're just going to have to do this. But I'm with you, players. I've always been with you, and it's just a shame. I think they wanted him to wear the black hat and do all the dirty work for them.
I think there already is a rule. I just think that he isn't enforcing it, and they wanted him to enforce it.
I think they wanted him to save them from themselves, which just shows you that the collective courage among NFL owners would probably not fill a sippy cup. So this last week, we got yet another Obama scandal. This one where we find out that when it comes to the whole Russia won uranium deal, and that was an effort by some Russian companies to buy up a company in the United States that has uranium mines. The deal essentially gave them control over 20% of the United States uranium deposits. The Secretary of State is required to sign off on any deal like that because, as you would imagine, there's a process for looking at those kinds of deals to ask whether or not they're in the interest of the country. And yet, Secretary Clinton signed off on the deal, and miraculously, the former president, her husband, was almost at the exact same moment being paid $500,000 to give a speech in Russia, and a bunch of money flowed to the foundation. But no connection whatsoever. Now we find out this week that the DOJ and the FBI knew that the Russians were heavily involved in bribing people in the nuclear power industry, and that there was mounting evidence that this deal may have involved a great deal of bribery on the part of the Russians to the Americans involved in the business deal. Now, anybody at the government level who was reviewing this deal, if they had a hint that there was bribery involved in this business transaction, should never have signed off or even considered signing off on the deal. The fact that the DOJ and the FBI knew means that, and they had an active investigation which was continually getting delayed, but the evidence was mounting, that was either never shared, which I don't believe, or key people like Eric Holder had to know. He was the head of the DOJ, and he sits on this committee that does the process of reviewing these kinds of deals. There is no way that key people didn't know this or shouldn't have known this when they signed off on this deal. It's an enormous scandal. People were clearly bribed, perhaps even the Clintons themselves, although there's no smoking gun evidence of that at this point. But it got me to thinking about all of the Obama scandals. The myth that the liberal commanding heights, which includes the left-wing press, the myth that they're already trying to spin is that the Obama administration was one of the most scandal-free administrations in American history. The exact opposite is the truth. What's amazing about the Obama scandals and everything that happened in that administration is that so little was done to prosecute anyone. There were so few consequences. There were some congressional committees that investigated things, but there were nothing ever moved forward to holding anyone accountable. The most that ever happened was that Eric Holder was held in contempt over Fast and Furious. But other than that, no one was ever held accountable. And that is what I think is the most important feature Many presidents have had investigations. Many presidential administrations have even had people arrested or convicted of crimes. What's amazing about the Obama administration is that none of the myriad scandals ever moved towards an actual arrest. And that was Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch controlling the Department of Justice the whole time. They essentially acted as a protection racket, making sure that no one was ever held accountable in the various scandals that engulfed the Obama administration. And I want to list some of them. I spent some time the other day coming up with just a short list. I want to be very clear that this is not an all-encompassing list of the Obama scandals, but it gives you a sense of just how corrupt this administration was. So we find out after Obama leaves office that less than 1% of the Guatemalans that came to the U.S. came to escape violence, in quotes. Why is that a scandal? Because when we had this flood of illegal immigrants over the border coming from Central America, many of them unaccompanied minors, the story that was put out by the Obama administration was that there was this enormous gang violence in Central America, and that these people were fleeing that these mothers were so distraught at the danger to their children that they were allowing them to travel to the United States unaccompanied. That's how horrible the violence was in places like Guatemala. Then, eventually, the government admits less than 1% of the Guatemalans that came to the United States were coming to, quote, escape violence. So that whole story about what was driving that flood of immigration, illegal immigration into the United States, was a lie. And it was an Obama scandal. And if you don't think that isn't a huge scandal, think about all of those people that have now been, crossed the border, were caught and released. The unaccompanied minors were put into homes and resettled all over the United States. We know for a fact that some tropical diseases and others came in, and that there were American children in those public schools with them who caught those illnesses and died, and that's never been accounted for. Then there's the violence that's perpetrated by these immigrants when they come in. It is safe to say that a number of these unaccompanied minors joined local gangs like MS-13 and the rest. How many people have been murdered, raped, robbed as a result of that flood of illegal immigration that came in on a lie? Here's another one for you. So shortly after Obama left office, it was revealed that they had moved all of the National Security Council documents to his presidential library. Why is that important? Because things in the presidential library are exempt from Freedom of Information requests. So places like Judicial Watch and others that are trying to get at the Benghazi scandal and even the unmasking, all of this stuff that went around Trump, many of the documents that they would like to get their hands on now sit, quote, at the Obama Presidential Library, where they're protected by these 10 or 25-year locks on them, where they don't have to release anything, even under Freedom of Information request. So these were government documents generated at the time, Freedom of Information requests pending, and they moved the documents using basically a loophole out of the reach of the public to see and understand. That's a massive scandal. We mentioned it earlier in this podcast, but another scandal, the billions sent to Iran that now fund terrorist groups throughout the Mideast. It now turns out, we learned recently, that the Obama administration hid intel that was coming out on Iranian militants, and they made sure that that information did not see the light of day while they were negotiating the Iran deal, and claiming that Iran is harshly judged, too harshly judged, and that they're a lot of this stories about them being involved in terrorist activities is overblown. They had mounting evidence coming out of the military about what Iranian militants were doing, and they actively suppressed that information while they were negotiating the Iran deal. Let's go to the Black Lives Matter movement and the hands up hoax that came out of Ferguson that Obama got behind and his administration got behind, that whole movement, and supporting that protests and the what do we want, pigs in a blanket, all of that. They supported every bit of that. And what happened, right? Because Ferguson was 2014. Well, the homicide rate has been tracked in places like Ferguson and other urban areas, and the incremental number of blacks murdered due to homicide has spiked since the Black Lives Matter and Ferguson movement of 2014. And it is likely higher. It is now, that number, that incremental increase in the number of blacks murdered since 2014 is now likely higher than the number of blacks lynched in the entire history of the United States, just to give you a comparison. And the Obama administration and their support of that whole movement has resulted in a noticeable increase in the murder of black people in the United States. That's a scandal, and you don't hear the press talking about it. Of course, there's the Fast and Furious gun sting, in which the government was selling weapons that they thought they were going to track into the underworld, and it was going to build all these cases. What ended up happening was they lost track of the weapons, these high-powered weapons, a number of which ended up in the hands of Mexican cartels. We know of at least one person who was murdered with one of those weapons. Eric Holder stonewalled on that, and it became such an issue with the Congress that was the one time they were actually willing to move on something, and they held Eric Holder in contempt of Congress. I believe he's the only attorney general ever to be held in contempt of Congress, something that he's still bitter about. He deserved far worse. We find out after the fact that James Comey admitted that he confronted Lynch about her political interference in his investigations. We also find out after the fact that James Comey wrote a report exonerating Clinton well before his investigation into her email servers was over, about that tarmac meeting between Loretta Lynch and Bill Clinton. The DOJ and FBI have recently admitted that they have far more emails relating to that meeting that they have not turned over. Judicial Watch has forced them to admit that, and they've told a court judge, because Judicial Watch is suing, they have admitted that there are many more emails that they will be turning over soon. This far after the fact. Let's talk about Bowie Bergdahl, the soldier who went missing and who the president, when he traded terrorists for Bowie Bergdahl, said that Bowie had served his country with honor. So we gave terrorists. The president lied about whether this guy was actually a deserter, and he has now in the last week admitted to desertion and misbehaving with the enemy. He actually pled guilty to those charges, desertion and misbehaving with the enemy. So 6 American soldiers died looking for Bowie Bergdahl, and the president held a Rose Garden celebration when he announced the trading of those terrorists for a man who this week admitted to desertion and misbehaving with the enemy. The New York Times, in another scandal, was willing to go forward and blame the Obama administration officials for releasing information that a U.S. general says allowed an ISIS leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, to slip away from American forces. Another Obama scandal. Then, of course, there's Benghazi, which both Clinton and the president were involved in which they had not provided enough security. First of all, they're responsible for creating the chaos in Libya. Then they put the ambassador in harm's way and clearly did not respond to repeated requests for increased security there. Then, when the annex comes under attack and a firefight ensues that draws out for upwards of 14, 16 hours, they never send any help during that time. But the key to that scandal is to remember that all of this happened about a month or so before the 2012 election, in which Obama was trying to get reelected as president. The administration panicked about how badly that was all handled and the fact that the ambassador and 3 others were killed, and they moved to essentially hoax the American public. They needed to buy themselves time to get past the election, so they put out the lie that this whole thing had been started by a video, and they even sicked the Department of Justice on this poor guy in California who made this video that was blasphemous to Muhammad. They claimed it had all, but at the time, we now know, and I think they knew eventually it would come out. All they cared about was getting through the next 6 weeks and getting that re-election. But ultimately, what rolled out was that the Hillary Clinton, in her private emails, both to foreign officials and to her own daughter, was admitting on the very first day that this was a terrorist attack and that it was executed by a terrorist organization, that it had nothing to do with any video. But Susan Rice dutifully went on the weekend shows and put that lie out there to buy them time. And it worked. It worked because the truth of Benghazi didn't come out until long after President Obama had been reelected. And that is a huge scandal.
What was the name of that movie that was about Benghazi that told the truth?
13 Hours.
Recommend you see that if you can find it or get the video.
We're not even done with our list. There was the IRS targeting. Remember that the president sicked the IRS, he and his people sicked the IRS on all the Tea Party groups that were forming in 2010, and they were denied their nonprofit status, many, in some cases, for years. And Lois Lerner, she got away with all of that, took the fifth, never prosecuted, and ultimately retired with her pension. It was also revealed during the administration that they were secretly eavesdropping on reporters at the Associated Press and even James Rosen of Fox News. Eavesdropping on reporters. Can you imagine if a Republican president was found to have been doing that? And that was a one-week story. The press itself couldn't even muster the anger to continue to press on that. They literally moved on shortly after it was revealed. You have the DACA and DAPA executive orders that protected minors and their parents from deportation. Completely illegal. And I think the president and his people knew it. It was simply bought them time. But a court has already found that DAPA was not legal, and part of the reason why the president has suspended DACA is because Jeff Sessions is telling him it's indefensible. The other companion executive order has already been found to be unconstitutional. The president doesn't have the authority to do that, and therefore everybody understands that DACA will be found unconstitutional as well. The president didn't care. He signed those orders anyway. What about the 2009 $1 billion stimulus package? Do you remember that? Right after the president came into office, the first thing that he did, and they had their majorities in both the House and the Senate, they wanted to pass this stimulus package, which was so desperate to get the country working again because we'd had this sharp economic recession and we needed this flood of cash to get people working again. Remember, there were going to be all these shovel-ready jobs. I ask you now, can you think of one bridge, road, building anywhere that has a sign that says that this was built with the $1 billion stimulus package from 2009? This was money, a $1 billion package that was designed to fund public works projects all over the country to just literally get people working. And all it did was it flowed into, a lot of it went to states to shore up their budgets, which was basically a bailout of public employee unions. Most of what that package did was to insulate public employee union members from the massive layoffs that everybody in the private sector was experiencing in 2009. You'll remember back then that a lot of companies were downsizing very dramatically and laying people off. And the tax rolls were shrinking as a result in every state. And that was forcing a lot of states to face the prospect of having to lay a bunch of public employees off. So, gasp, public employees were going to have to participate in the same recession that the rest of us were. But that's what the $1 billion stimulus, which was sold as a public works project, what it actually did is it went in the form of large checks to all of the states to shore up their budgets so that they didn't have to lay anybody or as many people off. So it was just a bailout of the public employee unions. And it built nothing. And it did not stimulate the economy in any way, shape, or form. That $1 billion simply disappeared into the ether. Then there's Hillary Clinton's email server, which is an Obama scandal because, as we now know, they knew she had this server. The president had a private email, and he was communicating with her on that server and her private email. So they knew that she was doing this, and they didn't do anything about it. And it turns out that a number of the administration officials had private email accounts in which they were talking to each other and conducting business that was, they thought, exempt from FOIA requests. And of course, if you don't know that a person like Loretta Lynch or Barack Obama has a secondary email somewhere that they can communicate people with, you don't even know to get it under a FOIA request. Remember that during the Obama administration, we saw an absolute first. The EPA itself, the Environmental Protection Agency, massively polluted the Colorado River. They turned it orange. Pictures ran in every paper in the country.
How did they do that?
They were doing some work near a mine that had a pool of this dirty water, and their workers breached this dam, and all of this polluted water flowed out and into the tributary, which then emptied into the river, and it turned the whole thing orange. Massive pollution. Fish die off, all the rest. Now, if a private company had done this, there would have been massive fines. People perhaps even could have gone to jail over that. No one was ever held accountable at the EPA as a result of that significant act of pollution.
Why did the EPA do that?
Why were they were doing some reclamation work, they were doing...
You mean by mistake?
Yes.
They did this?
Yes.
Oh, my.
They screwed up, and they breached this dam.
And, of course, no one ever reported about it.
Well, everyone reported about it at the time. There were pictures on papers all across the country of the river turned orange from all of this pollution. It was a huge deal, but nothing ever happened to anyone. The EPA just basically said, well, we're the EPA. Oops. And they moved on. Then there was the VA scandal. Now, there are almost always VA scandals during presidential administrations because the VA has been so poorly run for such a very long time. But it was during the Obama administration that we found out that they had secret death lists of veterans that veterans were put on while executives handed in phony status reports and signed themselves up for big bonuses. And as far as we can tell, not a lot of movement from the Obama administration to fix that problem, but it was a number one priority of Trump when he came in, and one of the things that everyone said was impossible to do, which was to get the VA computer system synced up with the Pentagon's computer system so that when a veteran retired, their records could seamlessly transfer over to the VA. Oh, it's too complicated. Trump got that accomplished in his first 6 months in office. And the last one on my list, but certainly not the last Obama scandal, was Libya in its entirety. That war was probably illegal. To this day, no one can tell any American with any satisfaction why in the world we assisted that movement to overthrow Gaddafi. The country is now a complete basket case and a haven for terrorists, and an importer-exporter of all sorts of nefarious things like weapons to other rogue nations. It is far worse than it was when it was being run by Gaddafi, and it's not like we hadn't had the lesson by deposing Saddam Hussein. And it was the Democrats that had claimed that that was a big mistake and should not have happened. And then Obama comes into power, and he and Secretary Clinton jump at the chance to depose another dictator in the Mideast and create an absolute basket case in Libya. Nothing was gained. Ultimately, American lives were lost in the whole Benghazi scandal, which stands separately. But no one was ever held accountable for the decisions that were made to essentially destroy the country of Libya. And that's only the list that I'm going to provide today. It is by no means comprehensive, but it gives you an idea of why you should laugh heartily whenever you hear somebody say the Obama administration was the most scandal-free in American history.
That's quite a list and brings back memories that I had forgotten. So thank you for reminding me. But I disagree with you about Libya. You said no one ever valued from that and wrecked the country and so forth. Well, if no one ever received any value for that, why was it done? Which leads me to the question of just who got paid what.
Certainly someone benefited, but the American people didn't. So we're just about out of time, and I would remind you that this show can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Cast. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. So I'm hoping you'll share this show with your very best friend who you know will love this. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.